the India's Most Trusted Brand of the Year Awards 2024 with the first award category, which is Best UGC NET JRF English Coaching in Delhi by Vineet Pandey. It goes to Professor Vineet Pandey.
दिल्ली में CMP द्वारा दूसरा अंतर्राष्ट्रीय सम्मेलन डॉक्टर दीक्षा त्रिपाठी ने थैनेटोपॉलिटिक्स पर चर्चा की।
It is my honor to invite our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Panagiotis Pentaris, who is joining us virtually today. Dr. Pentaris is an associate professor of social work and thanatology at Goldsmiths University of London. With his pioneering research on death, bereavement, diversity, and disaster social work, he has been a guiding light in understanding the social and cultural dimensions of mortality. We warmly welcome you, sir, and look forward for your address. Yeah, give him a huge round of applause, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope the sound carries well. And thank you for the introduction as well, and all the previous speakers. And I think I'd like to start with a quote from an American writer and poet from the 19th century, Emily Dickinson, just in terms of the context and the content of this conference. And I want to start with this quote that says, "Unable are the loved to die, for love is immortality." And very often the intertwinement of posthumanism, transhumanist theories and philosophies, as well as thanatology as a science, sort of find themselves at that intersection. And Dickinson's words generally echo that across centuries. And it's not just as a sentiment, but as a provocation in a world interestingly trying to save the biopolitical aspects and trying to ensure that all those are infinitely in that place where they need to speak that language, where we all can come together interdisciplinary in this perspective. I'm not going to share any slides. I will try and just speak in relation to posthuman thanatology specifically, and try and fit that into the concepts that this conference is trying to address, and hopefully that will be a good contribution for the dialogue. And before anything, I want to start with what is thanatology, because I think various terms have been used so far, and we're talking about thanatopolitics and necropolitics and the sort. But let's talk about the science. And thanatology is that interdisciplinary study of death and dying, and it relates directly to societal and often individual behaviors as well as rituals. And it was mentioned in the beginning of this day that it stems from that mythological figure, Thanos and Thanatos, which is the word for death in Greek, as well as that ology, sort of the science and the study. And it spans various different disciplines and empirical fields, and it goes across the complexity of human mortality. And historically, that field has emerged to counter society's continuous avoidance in one way or another of death discussions, or avoidance of finding a common ground for understanding the different complexities of those discussions. And different scholars over the centuries, in fact, have been talking about this, talking about philosophers particularly, but also scholars from the 20th century, and thinking about Gore's work and Aria's work that talk about the cultural influences, while there's that growing awareness of death anxiety that is led by educational efforts that directly have aimed at easing that discomfort and fear that we find in different places. And of course, modern colleagues have continuously been writing about this. And the field has practically relevance, or has a practical relevance to practice and to medicine and psychology and to law and also bioethics, applied bioethics particularly. And there's a subfield there that talks about legal thanatology, which focuses on the betterment of end-of-life policies, for example, and we've got plenty of works around that, especially that of Tarasevich, and also another subfield that focuses on the music thanatology, or we've got comparative thanatology. One of the previous speakers mentioned climate inferences and environmental inferences and how the human body returns back to Earth and what implications that has for this Earth. And so comparative studies in thanatology really look at going across the species and exploring those ideas about posthumanity in many, many different ways. The historical context of death is particularly shaped by diverse cultural aspects as well as social, but also philosophical, whether those are grounded in the big thinkers or whether those are grounded into the philosophers of everyday life. And those influences have been direct and indirect both. And societies generally have long developed that unique set of rituals and different beliefs and different educational efforts to try and be more prepared around dying. And we've seen that in history, and anthropological research has often made a huge amount of effort around this. Medieval treatises, for example, if we go back to that era, began to formally create death education and introduce death education, trying to explore the philosophical and psychological dimensions of that. And this has laid a particular foundation for modern thanatology and what we do today, those of us in thanatology, and where we intersect with posthumanism as well, trying to address the different concepts of anxiety surrounding that experience, but also the different avoidances that we find in different communities and in different societies. Philip Harris, one of the 20th century historians who traced different attitudes around death and around grief and around dying and what we do or what we don't do, has emphasized those shifting attitudes that we found around it and sort of drew from the pre-industrial societies that embraced communal mourning. Well, the more modern ones focused on that medicalization of death, and there was that distancing of the families from the actual reality of death and the actual reality of grief. And such a context is really significant when we want to talk about posthumanism and the beyond the human and mortality beyond humans, because we need to understand what the starting point is. And the starting point is very different from place to place. It'd be very difficult for us to try and universalize any of this conversation. And there are particular indigenous communities that would in fact have a more communal factor based upon which they experience their own lives, and there will be a different reality for them. Thanatology generally has emerged to bridge those different gaps and really drawn the interdisciplinarity of what we all do today and try and provide further guidances to how we appreciate the meaning of life, the meaning of death, the process of dying, the experience of dying, when that happens, when does it not happen, and so on. And in my work, I do have a focus on transhumanist perspectives and theories and working integratively with those to try and discuss posthumanism more generally. So I will talk a little bit about technological advancements, and particularly the degree to which those have significantly influenced the processes surrounding death and dying. And they've been transforming healthcare practices. They've been transforming social interactions as well as individual experiences through all the digital platforms and tools that are becoming available to people. Diksha Tripathi earlier showed on the screen one of the death of the suicide pods, for example. That's a great example of that digital innovation that whether it promotes life or it promotes death, or whether it is useful, beneficial or not, is a different conversation, but it is a reality. And the integration of technology more generally or the integration of it in an end of life overall has created many dimensions for how we manage both practically and emotionally the aspects of dying, the process of dying. One of the most prominent changes that have been brought about by technological advancements is the emergence of digital health technologies in end-of-life care, and tools such as the telehealth services that tend to enable healthcare professionals to provide remote consultations and ongoing support to patients, and enhancing patient comfort and accessibility to care. And this is not purely rooted in any philosophical discourse, what I'm saying, this dimension, but it is a discourse that stems from philosophical understandings of a societal relationship with death and life. And it is an example, these digital health technologies are an example exactly of what thanatopolitics might look like in practice, in an everyday scenario. It is the fact that those digital technologies are not necessarily accessible by everyone. They're not necessarily available to everyone. They are, in fact, limited to those that either have the literacy to access them or they have the resources to access them. Those innovations then can facilitate a more smoother transition to dying and to end of life, while they also ensure that patients' needs are effectively addressed on an everyday basis. And therefore, the argument becomes that they improve quality of life. We're parking that aside because there's a big debate on that. Another quite notable impact of the technologies that we see is that creation and management of digital legacies. And, in other words, the concept of immortality and how that links to those technological advancements. And as individuals start generating increasing amounts of digital content, ranging from social media profiles or personal blogs or all those kind of user-led machinery and software, the discussions around what happens to the digital footprint after one has died become quite prevalent, and they come to the forefront. And works like that of Budalor have quite emphasized that in terms of what policies and legislation could support the management of it altogether. And again, that's another example of thanatopolitics and how particular institutions, whether those are inclusive of different policies or not, manage the way we articulate, use, or not use different information that becomes available online. The digital legacy management methods more generally have that aim of providing frameworks for handling these concerns that I've mentioned and allow individuals to decide how they want their online presence to be treated posthumously. And of course, more and more practices in funeral directions sort of start taking that into account even further, and quite often having religious influences stripped off of them. That rise now of social media is another huge component that we cannot avoid when talking about posthumanism more generally and transhumanist understandings of dying in contemporary societies. And those platforms, those tools have also transformed not only dying, but mourning practices, sort of the public expression of grief. And online memorials have become a huge thing. The digital tributes have become very popular venues for many and collective mourning. And those do allow individuals to share their experiences, and they allow individuals to support each other in a public forum. And drawing on the theory of the 80s about disenfranchised grief and the experience that's not socially acknowledged, we've moved to the theory of enfranchised grief of the 21st century, where the support system is not available in a community, in a physical community. It becomes available in an online world, and that essentially is one of the solutions that's been directed towards the necropolitical experiences that many individuals that are marginalized in a particular society might have. And research quite often, and that includes research that has been done from Bassett and Graf Drasch and various others, that has shown that the ability to interact with memorial pages can help bereaved individuals navigate their own grief and foster ongoing connections to lost loved ones more generally. And I guess this dimension sort of shows us that on the one hand, we have the realities of necropolitical suspension of mourning, but at the same time, technology comes to foster a space where it tackles some of that necropolitical dimension. The other point is that around digital immortality, of course, more generally, and the notion of the virtual human specifically. And there are numerous examples that could be explored. And the Project 2045 is a very good example, looking at how medical experts would be able to be based in Switzerland, but then through a robot have their consciousness and knowledge been acting in Australia in order to operate on someone. So those virtual humans are not just the avatars, but the virtuality of consciousness and how that transfers. And the notion of those humans sort of showcases another intriguing aspect of how technology engages with death more generally. And those technologies sort of enable the preservation of personality traits, but also behaviors through different AI tools, and create that possibility of digital avatars, but also robotic representation of one's personality traits from afar. And those can then interact with the living. We have a great example that originated in Japan about the AI, the anthropomorphic robot, where you can upload your personality traits, voice, all of the memories that have been stored online, and it creates a representation of the individual that has died into that, so that then you have that ongoing interaction with the living. The subnote there is, of course, there's a great amount of bioethical concerns related to that. And that's where my focus generally has been with my work. There's ethical and moral complications. The design generally of technology has also been oriented toward handling, or better handling, death and bereavement perhaps, but at the same time it raises those concerns about what is right and what is wrong, and who owns those initiatives, who owns posthumanity. If the starting point is that we are a human race that cannot think beyond human, how do we appreciate and conceptualize the posthuman? And that is a key question to be asking. A very significant implication in this field, or in the field of the subfield of posthuman thanatology, if you like, is that there has been improved access to different support services via the telehealth technologies, and telemedicine as an example, which becomes more integrated into the different systems of care, and patient suffering quite often from terminal illnesses, and of those that don't choose to end their lives via assisted dying, for example, that they can receive more timely and more comprehensive care than they would otherwise, and also even when traveling. And so we've seen massive examples and changes through the data from the World Health Organization of how that has changed the way people have engaged with the services. And the emergence of the digital legacies raises that question also about identity and memory preservation. So digital platforms might allow individuals to create those legacies through social media and online memorials, and making that grief a public shared experience. And this shift may be transforming how different individuals might commemorate those that die, and maintain different connections with deceased loved ones, and fostering that collective remembrance that can be very therapeutic for the person. And if I link this to the quote by Dickinson that I've shared in the beginning, that for those that have been loved, their love is their immortality itself, then preserving that identity and the memory and the love that has been experienced in the relationship that has never died might be indeed that form of immortality that we might be talking about. And a couple more notes around digital immortality through the virtual avatars specifically. that those do raise some philosophical questions regarding the existence after death. And as we see technologies advancing and going to a place where they start replicating personality traits and behavioral characteristics posthumously, they start challenging traditional notions of identity. And I think the speaker right before me kind of mentioned that challenge as well in different words. But there's that challenge of the finality of death. And this phenomenon starts inviting discussions surrounding the implications for different cultural and spiritual beliefs about the afterlife, pardon me, as well as the different psychological effects on those who might engage with the digital representations of their deceased loved ones. Now, just an additional point around the social media effect and the mourning practices, pardon, and the mourning practices, those do have the tendency, as we've seen over the last 15 years, to prompt a cultural shift in how grief is expressed and understood, and of course, how death is understood as well. And we've seen studies where they do show that children's understanding of death, even though what we knew before based on developmental stages and theories that explain those and the different traits in the different age groups, start shifting a little bit, because the finality of death that has been perceived by a 9-year-old and over sort of starts changing, because there's a different cultural perception of how that death is not final, because the person continues to exist online. There is a major change in how grief has been medicalized because of those platforms. And now we see more public sharing of loss. We see more of the turning mourning into a more collective experience. And such openness starts reducing the stigma that also comes with death and grief more regularly. An example would be suicide and the stigma that comes with it, and culturally the stigma that is attached to the family left behind or the friends. But it starts empowering individuals and communities to express their grief more freely in that open world. And socially shared mourning as an act has emerged more vividly through those technologies, and it created those communities where collective process of grief becomes the resolution from the fear of death that's been discussed in the previous century, whilst the posthumanist understanding around it remains quite in its infancy, I would say. The philosophy of death, I just want to twist this a little bit to focus a little bit on the posthumanist aspect, and the philosophy of death within the framework of posthumanism reflects significant shifts in how we conceptualize mortality, how we conceptualize our identities, how we conceptualize the boundaries of human existence altogether. And posthumanism, with its critical, perhaps, approach to Enlightenment humanism, comes to challenge the traditional notions of what it means to be human, and consequently how death and dying are understood, which I've mentioned earlier. So this paradigm shift has implications for ethics, for technology, but also the very essence of life and death. And this is an iteration of what's been said already. But one central philosophical stance in posthumanism is the decentering of the human as the primary subject of philosophical inquiry. And that's quite critical, because it changes altogether inquiry of philosophy. So instead, what it does is it starts advocating for a more inclusive understanding of existence that encompasses the non-human entities that are both living and artificial. And I'm not talking about the environment, I'm talking about humans and artificial additions to our lives. So this shift prompts that reevaluation of death, and suggests that death is not merely an end to human life, but a universal phenomenon affecting a broader, perhaps interconnected web of existence. And in this context, the boundaries between human mortality and non-human death become blurred, and they lead to a more comprehensive exploration of life and death that includes technological entities and ecological systems. And the social implications of this rethinking could be profound. Posthumanist thinkers often, and I'm thinking of Bradati, for example, would propose that the very fabric of of existing is relational, and that identities which include existences are constituted through the networks of interactions with non-human life forms and the environment. And therefore, such a suggestion perhaps leads to the suspicion that posthuman realities cannot exist without humans within the same existence. And this relational aspect implies that death is not an isolated event, but part of a continuous network of life processes. And such a perspective might encourage more ethical considerations about how we engage with non-human species and the environments we inhabit, particularly as we confront the existential threats like climate change that's been mentioned earlier today. In addition to all of that, the integration of technology into the human existence raises the question about immortality and the transcendence of biological limitations. And there are different figures like Dalila who have explored ideas of death in relation to technological advancements such as cryonics, suggesting that the desire for immortality is not just a human inclination, but a posthuman potential that complicates traditional understandings of mortality. Mind you, and I'm certain all of us in the room are familiar with this, but humans have aimed for immortality since the beginning of time, and the elixir of life and the transfixion to all the different teas and herbs that would be used to prolong life have always been a reality. So these technologies not only allow for the possibility of extending life, but challenge our conceptualizations of what it means to die. So what does it mean to die? Is it final? Is it not? In what way is it final? And if it's not final and it's digitally immortal, who owns that? And who's the author of this life now? In a society generally and increasingly integrated with technology, death can be seen through the lens of enhancement, where the post-human condition may involve living beyond biological constraints. And I think that's the punchline from that. And the implications for ethics are also very significant. And as posthumanism calls for a rethinking of responsibility toward both human and non-human entities, as we begin to dissolve the strict boundaries between beings, the ethical considerations surrounding death and dying as an experience dying extend to include our responsibilities toward other life forms and the ecological impacts of our actions. And this holistic perspective necessitates a broader understanding of how practices around death, such as cremations and burials, can affect the living world as well. And those are conversations that continuously emerge into the field of thanatology over the last decade. And if I have just a couple more minutes, I'll share a few more thoughts that I'm thinking of the posthumanist critique of Cartesian dualism, which highlights the necessity of reconsidering the relationship between body and mind, and especially in the context of technological integration. And as consciousness becomes increasingly interrogated, whether that's through like uploading of minds and consciousness or through the merging of human and machine, philosophical discussions about death must contend with what occurs when consciousness and identity are no longer strictly tethered to a physical body. And so this blurring prompts critical questions about the essence of selfhood and continuity after death, and suggests that death may take a new meaning in a posthuman era. And posthumanism, I guess, in conclusion of that, posthumanism necessitates a reevaluation of ethical responsibilities toward other life forms and the environment, while emphasizing that our actions as humans concerning death impact the broader ecological and social systems. And so the posthuman dialogue perhaps needs to more fully encompass that. And I guess I might just recap and share just a couple of concluding thoughts, and then I'll end there. The first is, because what I'm here to contribute today is that kind of piece of knowledge around how do we reimagine death and dying in a post-human era. And the first point and the first concluding thought is that of the redefining mortality. So post-human thanatology challenges that traditional notion of death, and it emphasizes the interconnectedness of human and non-human experiences, and such a perspective can help us to rethink mortality beyond a purely human-centric view and look at it from different perspectives. There's the technological mediation, so that integration of technologies in the different processes and how that shapes the experiences. How does it change them? Is there a so-called digital afterlife? And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for those that are in our family system, in our friend circle? What about the social dimensions of grief and the rise of the social media, which continuously revolutionizes the experiences of mourning, and it starts turning it into a more socially shared and publicly visible act that might take more political dimensions rather than social or individual. And of course, that has an aspect of necropolitical understanding underpinning it. There are the cultural implications as well, which I think are so important. And I appreciate a dialogue of posthumanism, but perhaps the dialogue can be global, but at the same time, it has to be local. So in terms of how does it apply on a local level, and how does that local level can support and inform the global conversation, and vice versa. The ethical responsibilities is a key factor as well. And it's important to be drawing on that and looking at the eschewing of human exceptionalism in posthumanism, which also urges to reevaluate our ethical obligations towards life altogether. So that's a massive question to be asking as well. And of course, the emerging narratives of the resistance towards it, and there are various different religious discourses around it, and I won't go into that. So I will stop there, and I will simply say that Thanatopolitics, it's a wider conversation, and there's different fields that can be contributing to that. Posthuman thanatology specifically opens up a dialogue about the multiplicity of death experiences in an increasingly interconnected world, or in a world where we're increasingly starting to understand what the interconnectedness means, which we have been experiencing for decades. And it starts embracing a framework which allows a deeper reflection of how we remember the dead, how we grieve the dead, but also how we find meaning in life and death, and meaning of death in our own lives while being alive. I will stop there. Thank you, everyone, very much. I think I'm out of time anyway, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pentaris, for that deeply moving keynote address from London. Your reflections on technology, necropolitics, digital immortality, artificial intelligence, and grief have left us with important questions to carry forward. Even across continents, your words have reached us with clarity and depth. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all come together in a warm round of applause again to thank Professor Pentaris.